Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 114. Thargeen and Tony. Part 1. Thargeen was looking forward to this first trip to Midgard. The only bothersome bit was having to leave Aldvi behind. Someone had to sit the throne, and unfortunately their eldest, while old enough to sit the throne, had zero desire to do so. Thargeen, not being one of those parents who pushed their kid into something they wanted no part of, hadn't tried to press the issue since their son had made his disinterest clear. Besides, Inbarthen would know the moment their son touched it. Whatever magic, and even the dwarves had not figured that out, made the kingmakers work, they never ever chose someone who started out a bad choice for king. Once crowned, it was possible for kings to go power mad, otherwise insane, or become a bad ruler, but they didn't start out that way. The most likely of their children to take Thargeen's place on the throne when the time came was actually their youngest child, incidentally a daughter. She wasn't even 500 years old yet, however, and so was far too young to step up as even regent for a week or two, even with Aldvi there to help her. That kind of responsibility had no business on the shoulders of someone so young, even in part. Aldvi, of course, couldn't enforce royal decrees or the like, but Thargeen had made a point from day one of their engagement, never mind their marriage, of making it clear to his people that her word was as his word. If she spoke, his people would obey her as if she were him. By this time, they did it automatically, without considering that they technically didn't have to. That, however, was the only real wrinkle. He'd miss Aldvi, but it was only a week or two. In the meantime, he'd get to investigate Midgard and see just what else Tony Stark was capable of. That suit had been utterly fascinating. Thargeen was not dumb enough to think it was the only thing Stark had created. Such a thing would be master-level craft for a non-magically enhanced item among his people. Had the way it was powered been magical, it would have been journeyman level at the very least. It had been intricate, elegant, sleek, and deadly, despite Stark's demurs about its true capabilities. Stark had definitely come up with something else prior to that suit. No one pulled off something that good for their first attempt. Thargeen wouldn't be going to Midgard alone. Their master, shipbuilder Razdan, and the fleet general Kimpana would be going with him. They were taking the long way round in one of the small but very fast scout ships rather than using Heimdall and the Bifrost. They needed to become familiar with Midgard's spatial territory as well as the realm itself, which meant flying around. They had 3 basic goals for their visit aside from getting to know Midgard's spatial territory. The first, to assess hydroponics as a viable trade for the ships that had been commissioned. The second was for Razdan to get a good look at Midgardian control systems, whether on a seagoing ship or some other mode of transport. This needed to be done in order to create Tony Stark's specified idiot-proof controls. The more similar the spaceship's controls were to what Midgardians already knew, the easier it would be for them to use. The third was to get to know at least some of the Midgardians who might become the spaceship's crews. Tony had known, of course, that Thargeen would be showing up. Life may have gone insane after the realm tour, but yeah, he hadn't forgotten. He also knew that sooner rather than later, the governments of the world would twig to what the Avengers were doing and throw a shit fit or 3. Maybe 10. Tony couldn't have cared less if he tried. The Avengers literally didn't have a choice but to do things the way they were. If they tried to do this the right, legal way, the entirety of the 9 realms would be cinders and ash. There was absolutely no chance of getting even the major world powers to agree to a plan of action before Thanos showed up. Even if all of them believed that Thanos would show and that all he wanted was to kill everybody, they'd still take years or decades to agree on a plan of action. As things stood, Tony was willing to bet good money they'd spend the entire year just debating about whether Thanos would show up, and some of them would argue for trying to negotiate peace with the guy. In that light, Tony had done a quiet end run around certain governments to get in touch with their astronauts and submarine bridge crews. Word got put out about a new, updated, and streamlined control interface, and would anyone be interested in seeing this? With the Stark name behind it, it was hardly surprising that quite a few from all around the world had signed on to get a peek. Slightly underhanded, but it had been the best way Tony could think of to get his hands on the people best suited to fly spaceships without blowing the whistle about Thanos and what the Avengers were up to. Astronauts were, of course, a no-brainer, as they'd been trained to deal with space. Subcrews, while not trained to deal with zero gravity, were used to confined spaces and, more importantly, thinking and flying in 3 dimensions, which would make flying a spaceship a lot easier for them than for most. Granted, zero gravity wasn't going to be a factor, Tony didn't think. At least the ship they'd been on so briefly at Svartalfheim had gravity. Tony didn't know if the gravity would grab out thanks to damage, of course, but he didn't think it would. He couldn't see people renowned for their crafting skills building something so shoddily that would happen. "Sir, I do believe Thargeen has arrived. I am monitoring a small craft that is clearly dwarf-built based on the recordings from Svartalfheim that has reached Saturn's orbit," Jarvis suddenly piped up. Tony, who'd been in his lab working on a, shall we say, very special suit, nodded. "Right. Any idea how long before they get here?" "Given the ship's current rate of speed, approximately 6 hours, sir, which would put their arrival at 2 in the morning," Jarvis said, knowing full well that Tony lost all track of time when he was working in the lab. "Right. I'll clean up and let the others know. Can you get in contact with the ship?" Tony asked. "Unfortunately, no, sir. Their systems are not geared for electronic input. Once they are closer, a way may be possible, but at the current distance, there is no viable means of communication from our end. That said, they may well have a way to establish communication with us," Jarvis said. "Point," Tony admitted. "Worst comes to worst, we can have Loki teleport onto their bridge. We're going to want them to park in the deepest, darkest crater on the moon they can find, to keep their ship from being seen." "That would be the South Pole Aton Basin, sir," Jarvis said, his tone full of amused tolerance. Yeah, Tony had already known that. He just couldn't be bothered to remember the proper name of it. It's not like the moon was something he'd really ever had to concern himself with before. Tony headed out of his lab, trusting Jarvis to save his progress and file it appropriately, and headed up to the common entertainment floor. He was in luck. Most of the team, he included everyone currently living in the Avengers part of the tower in that statement, actual Avenger or not, was on the floor except for the terrible trio. Knowing Barton, he was probably in the basement firing range. Where Agent and Widow were at, Tony hadn't a clue and wasn't about to ask. He'd have Jarvis let them know if they were available. Peter, of course, was at home with his aunt, but he stopped by at least twice during the week and had planned to spend an entire weekend with them. Tony decided not to call him because of that. They were trying to keep his status as a hero type quiet, so calling him was a last resort. Jarvis was the best, but there was only so much he could do about electronic security outside of the tower without, becoming a more benevolent Skynet. Which he was willing to do when it became necessary, but doing it for a phone call was overkill. Pepper was the only one not in the tower at the moment. She was at a meeting with one of their suppliers in Japan. She had not actually been headed for a meeting in Japan when the invasion hit. That was just their private code for her getting as far away from the trouble zone as she could. Japan was almost exactly halfway around the world from the tower, as far away as it was possible to get from it. It was also the place closest to the halfway mark that they had business concerns with. The Philippines, which were the actual halfway point, they unfortunately had no business concerns with, which made it non-viable as a place for Pepper to be going for a meeting if she used the code in front of someone who knew enough about SI to know who they worked with. "Hey guys, Jarvis just picked up on a dwarf-built ship heading this way. We can't be sure, but odds are it's Thargeen and whoever else he decided to bring along," Tony announced. That brought John and Rogue's heads up from where they were playing one of the Halo games. "We get to meet... Awesome!" John drawled the last word, then grinned over at Thor and Loki, who had been watching the two teens play the game. "Not that meeting you two, who are, not human, wasn't cool, but you look human, That got a booming laugh from Thor and a tolerantly amused look from Loki.
"Aye," Thor said, "the dwarves are just enough different in appearance to make it clear they're not human."
Because while they were very definitely shorter than most adult humans, they didn't have the odd proportions associated with humans with dwarfism. nor were they quite perfectly proportional to their size by human standards. As befit a race that could and did spend their lives at very hard physical labor, they were broader through the shoulder and chest than most humans, especially ones their height. And most were far more heavily muscled than anyone short of a bodybuilder. Their legs, while not quite as markedly different as the rest of them, were built to support the extra weight. Their heads were proportionate to the rest of them as well, hence why Thargin's head couldn't fit into Tony's helmet despite him being smaller than Tony. At any rate, Jarvis approximates they'll be here around 2 in the morning. I suggest that anyone in need of a bit of sleep get it now, because we're going to be busy for at least a couple hours after they arrive getting them settled. Tony said, most of tomorrow we'll be getting them acclimated to the tower. Then we'll give them a tour and show them how hydroponics works. What happens after that, hell if I know. Probably a tour of the solar system, Steve piped up from where he was putting together a snack for himself, since they're going to be in charge of that end of the defense. Tony Mock scowled at Steve for remembering that when he didn't. Right, that's probably it. And he and Bruce would both be going at the very least. Probably also Jane and Betty. Peter was a bit iffier, since they'd have to both get May's permission and arrange for him to miss school for however long the tour took. But yeah, there was no way the science squad wasn't going on that trip. Sure, satellites got sent to record stuff from various planets, but it took forever, and Jarvis's eye machines could not think like a human or alter their programming, which meant it was a given they missed stuff. No scientist worth their salt would pass up the opportunity for an in-person look at the other planets in the solar system. Tony was just sad they didn't have a way to poke around personally. On the ground, as it were. Space suits might be okay for around Earth, but the odds they'd hold up even on Mars weren't good. The other planets? Ha! All of them would require specialized equipment Earth just didn't have to explore in person. Yet. There was a bit of cleaning up after that. Not that the common entertainment floor was a mess, but they did tend to leave stuff scattered around. Books, start pads, and other detritus that got left on the couches and chairs mostly. Just usually only overnight, but still it was there and needed tucking away. 4 hours later, they were indeed contacted by Thargin. How that worked, up to and including them being able to hear Tony's replies, was enough to drive Tony up a wall. Magic! Bah! He wasn't sure if he hated or loved it. Trying to figure out how it worked would drive him insane, and what it could do by turns fascinated and frustrated him. When this was all over, if they were both still alive, he was going to sit on Loki if he had to until he got some answers that made sense. At any rate, they found out they'd be playing host to 2 dwarves in addition to Thargin. Thargin parked their ship in the deepest part of the Aitken Basin, where they'd be the least likely to be detected. Jarvis had been busy the whole time ensuring that none of the satellites or telescopes aimed at space and capable of seeing the ship actually saw it. The time was coming when the world would find out what the Avengers were up to, but Tony hoped to have the first phase off the ground before they did. Once parked, they teleported directly into the tower. Magic. Ah!